We are here today to discuss lessons learned from recent catastrophes. These discussions are very timely. Just this past week, the folks in the Northeast experienced their fourth nor'easter in 3 weeks. Insured loss estimates on the previous nor'easters have been estimated as high as $1 billion. In 2017, more than 24 natural catastrophes struck across the U.S., many of which were billion-dollar disasters as well. Today's CIPR event will include a panel discussion on how experiences in preparing and responding to past catastrophes can better inform future actions. As part of this discussion, 3 key insurance regulators, a consumer advocate, and an insurer will share the insights they've gained from the recent significant disasters. However, before delving into the details, we will begin with an overview presentation of recent catastrophes and their economic impact. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenter, Stephen Clark, Vice President of Government Relations for the Insurance Services Office. Mr. Clark leads ISO's insurance legislative and regulatory activities, including overseeing its product compliance and other required filings. He has over 30 years of experience in the industry encompassing regulatory affairs, compliance, operations, and product development. He served for many years as an instructor at St. John's University School of Risk Management, is extensively published, and has been featured in numerous print and video articles. Now, please welcome Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Director Hammer. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. What I'm going to do is take a look at catastrophes in 2017. 2018, as we all know, was the year of the dog. Is the year of the dog. 2017 may well have been the year of the cat. But first, I want to start off with a little bit of history. Attention, all companies, members of the National Board of Fire Underwriters, and subscribers to the Actuarial Bureau. Confirmation of preliminary estimates indicate the tornado, which struck Amarillo, Texas, and surrounding area in the Texas Panhandle on Sunday, May 15, 1949, will result in losses of catastrophic proportions from windstorm and hail. It is therefore requested that you arrange to assign serial number 1 to this catastrophe and identify all losses paid in connection with this occurrence so that the necessary supplemental report of classification experience can be made to the Actuarial Bureau of the National Board at the end of the year. And so it began. Cat number 1. 69 years ago, the predecessor to ISO's current property claim service, which was established by the National Board of Fire Underwriters, issued the first catastrophe bulletin. This bulletin was issued in response to a tornado. Total damage ended up being around $8 million, but it did mark the beginning. So what is a cat? Back then, cats were looked at as a $5 million occurrence or greater, with a significant number of claims and significant number of insurers involved. Today, it's a little different. 25 million is the general threshold we use to establish a catastrophe for purposes of ISO's property claim services cat bulletins. That's all property, fixed property, building contents. We try and include time element losses to the best of our ability, vehicles, both personal and commercial, inland marine, which can be a significant contributor, plus also represents a very diverse set of property. And again, it has to affect a significant number of policyholders and insurers. We do this through a confidential survey of our insurer members, agents, adjusters, public officials, and others to try and get our handle on the amount of insured losses that are going to accompany a particular catastrophe. We analyze that data, apply some trend to it to determine the ultimate loss estimate. We do this so insurers can track overall losses and help establish their reserves. They know how big a claim or a catastrophe is expected to be. Our cat bulletins can serve as reinsurance triggers. The capital markets have looked to them, both through cat bonds as well as insurance-linked warranties. And it helps companies assign and allocate personnel. They'll know the extent of the storm, where it hit, what type of storm they're looking at, and what estimated amounts are going to be. 2017 definitely was the year of the cat. 46 distinct catastrophe bulletins were issued by ISO's PCS during the year. And we couldn't have started the year any earlier, January 1. That was our first event, a snow event, a winter storm, lasted January 1 through January 3. And we kept busy all year long, right through to the middle of December, when the last event occurred between December 7th and December 12th. Over 5 million claims fed into ISO's PCS program during the course of 2017. 4 of the top 20 cats of all time occurred in 2017. Hurricanes Maria, Irma, and Harvey, as well as the Tubbs fire. And but for a few $100 million, we could have said 4 of the top 6. The top 10. We weren't that far off. So it was definitely a very active year. We saw catastrophes right out of the bat with winter storms affecting the Midwest and the Ohio Valley. In February, these are the large billion-dollar cats. Again, winter storms March 6th through 9th. We saw tornadoes, hail, and wind coming into March with Cat 1722. The billion-dollar storms continued through May. More winter storms, more significant wind and hail and tornado events. And then we got into the real big cats. Hurricane Harvey struck towards the end of August, hitting Texas and dumping historical amounts of rain on the area. And that was just the first of what was going to be 3 very significant hurricanes that struck the area. Florida, we saw Hurricane Irma rake up the coast and effectively affect the entire state. And then, of course, Maria devastated the island of Puerto Rico, and even to this day, we're still looking at hundreds of thousands without power and quite a ways to go to recover. Then we turned our attention to the West Coast, California specifically. 3 separate wildfires struck the state of California, all billion-dollar events, and that kind of rounded out our $9 billion events. Hurricane Maria, second largest cat on record, $22 billion so far in insured losses that came in under ISO's PCS cat program, and they're still trying to recover. Business interruption goes on to this day. The Tubbs fire, largest fire in PCS history, $7 billion plus in losses alone from that fire, one of 3 in the Northern California area. And the way PCS cat program works, we do preliminary estimates, and then we continually resurvey insurers involved. We've already had 11 date extensions to the event as losses continued to come in. And then, lest you think catastrophes are always just hurricanes and wildfires, Cat 1732 was one of our largest non-tropical storm, non-fire catastrophe events. Over $2 billion in hail losses alone within the state of Colorado, largest hail event ever within the state of Colorado. So we definitely saw some of our biggest cats to date. 44 states, D.C., Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, all suffered from the 46 cats that we saw during 2017. There were billion-dollar events in numerous states. We saw Puerto Rico, $24 billion, Texas, $20 billion, California, $14 billion, Florida, $12 billion, even the U.S. Virgin Island alone, $4.6 billion in insured property losses. So we saw 9 states with billion-dollar losses, and 2 just missed out. Missouri and Nebraska were up in the $900 million range with tornadoes and wind, hail storms. Hurricanes, $56 billion. Tornado, wind, and hail and flood, $19 billion. Wildfires, $13 billion in total. Winter storms, $274 million. But don't be fooled by that number. Some people think it looks low. Well, 25 15 and 16 saw some of the biggest winter storm years on record, up in the multiple billions of dollars, particularly up in the Northeast. 2018 isn't starting off so good either, put that number in perspective. All told, PCS CAT bulletins logged over $90 billion in losses during the year. So let's put that into perspective. The latest biggest year, 2005, $62 billion, so we beat that by almost $30 billion. 2012 was a $35 billion year. 2011, $34 billion. That's when we saw a lot of the hurricanes coming in and a lot of the very large tornadoes and hailstorm events. First billion-dollar year was 1979. There was a couple of hurricanes struck down in the Gulf Coast. First billion-dollar event was 1989 with Hurricane Hugo. Blizzard of 1983 just missed out by about a little less than $100 million from being the first billion-dollar event. First $10 billion year, 1992, and that was Hurricane Andrew, actually a $22 billion event there. So we've seen losses grow tremendously, the size of catastrophes over the years. And following an F5 tornado in Moore, Oklahoma, we were looking at some of the information from that. And notice something I kind of refer to as the Moore progression. Moore, Oklahoma, located between Oklahoma City and Norman, since 1890 has had over 23 tornadoes strike generally the pretty much the same vicinity. In 1960, there was a swarm of F2s that caused about $8.5 million in damage. 73 saw a big F5, around $5 million. Then in 99, an F5 hit, $955 million in damage. 2013, and another F5 in almost the exact same path, over $1.1 billion in damage. Why do the losses keep growing so much? Is it because the storms are getting larger? Yes, a little bit. There were larger storms. But look at the population numbers. In 1960, 1,800 people lived in Moore, Oklahoma. When the 2013 F5 went through, over 58,000 residents called Moore home. So you see a very large growth in the size of the population, therefore the exposed property. And we see that all over the place. In Gulf coastal counties, or I should say coastal counties, Atlantic coast, Gulf coast, according to the latest U.S. Census Bureau data, over the last 40 years, over 126 people per square mile have moved in to Gulf coastal counties, whereas nationwide that number is closer to 30 per square mile. So we love to live near the beach. We love to live up in the mountains. And as we put more property there and more people there, you are going to see an increase in the losses. So after I'm talking about insured property losses, what about some of the gaps that you see? Well, flooding isn't just for flood zones. You've heard a lot of information over the course of this meeting where, for example, after Harvey, very few of the people had flood insurance. There's just a tremendous amount of rain, feet of rain, almost up to your eyes, and that water isn't going to go anywhere quickly. So many of those people are uninsured. Similarly, in Iowa and Louisiana around Baton Rouge in 2016, you can't get a foot of rain in a matter of hours and not have flooding. South Carolina in 2015, heavy rain and storms. People who were not in flood zones, therefore did not have flood insurance, saw a tremendous amount of losses. What about the cost to society? Let's look at wildfires. The U.S. Forest Service, $2.4 billion fighting wildfires annually. CAL FIRE spent $700 million in 2017. That's almost double their budget. It's estimated that wildfire suppression in the United States alone wildfires cost us $180 billion in suppression, insurance, and recovery afterwards. There's also an impact on government with respect to the fact that many of them are self-insured, either individually or through a pool or some kind of arrangement like that. When government property is damaged, somebody's got to pay for it. The pool, ultimately, potentially the taxpayer. And loss of tax revenues as businesses are shut down. We saw after Superstorm Sandy an extended period of business interruption, and the state is not collecting sales taxes. When property owners ask for a reevaluation of their property based on damage, property taxes can come down. So there can be a lot of impacts on government and society. And then, of course, our infrastructure. How many years removed are we from Superstorm Sandy, and we're still talking about the damage it caused to the Hudson River rail tunnels, Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, serving hundreds of thousands of commuters a day, and a lifeline to the metropolis of New York. You see that all over. 6-7 months after Hurricane Maria, still no power to much of Puerto Rico. The effect on communications, things of that nature. And then just generally the uninsured and underinsured. We're seeing earthquakes happen in places where people don't have earthquake insurance, so they're uninsured for that. NFIP only covers your property to a certain amount, $250,000 for residential, so you could be underinsured to the extent your property costs more than that. 2017, is that it? No. I don't want us to forget about other cats that can happen. ISO's historical global cyber monitor saw an uptick in 2017 in the amount of insured cyber losses. Couple of good, well, I guess some good things there and some dangerous things there. One is uptake is increasing. More people are getting cyber insurance, but there are more bad actors trying to get their access, get their hands on the data that we have. So cats aren't just direct property damage. We do have to consider cyber as a big threat. One of the other things that I didn't address here, because it really didn't happen, but we can't lose sight of, are two other property perils. One is earthquake. Down in Mexico, there was an earthquake in 2017, $6.9 billion in total damage, around $2 billion of it insured. People are waiting for the next big one here. It will happen at some point. And terrorism. Worldwide, we saw over 10,000 fatalities from terrorism. Billions of dollars in damage. But in this country, we've been very fortunate to have our law enforcement community protect us, and we haven't had the type of large event from a property loss perspective, but that possibility is always there. What have we learned from all these cats? Well, we've learned that models are important. Hurricane Andrew was the last event that we saw a lot of insolvencies out of. One of the reasons why we haven't seen many insolvencies since due to cats is we've learned the importance of aggregations, monitoring our aggregates. Models help us do that. We've learned the importance of reinsurance and capital markets and spreading the risk, and models all help kind of do that. Rating issues, we recognize engineering is important, looking at the specific building as well as the macro environment. And we've developed coverage tools from disaster limits to help rebuild during times of demand surge, deductibles, expanded debris removal, and recognition of ordinance and law, and the fact that you do have to consider increased costs of construction for ordinance or law. Building codes, strong codes are important. They must be enforced. So we do have to be careful that we don't allow people to kind of reduce our strength in building codes, loss prevention and mitigation, and resilience. That's a measure of a community's ability to kind of bounce back after a catastrophe. And our claims response. We know disaster teams are important. We have to get there to take care of our customers, and CAT bulletins can help companies to figure out exactly where and when to deploy teams. Is 2018 going to be deja vu all over again? It's kind of starting off like that. We've already closed out 5 cats for the year, 3 winter storms, a wind and hail event, and earth movement and flooding out in California. We have 2 other cats open, don't have all the dollars in yet. 1 more winter storm and another wind and hail event. We're already at about $2.9 billion with these events, so we're off to a strong start on cats. The 2018 hurricane forecast is calling for international and global weather conditions very similar to 2017. So will we see several of those large, big storms coming ashore? The effects of climate change are in the news. Bomb cyclones, polar vortexes, we're reading about all of them. So 2018 is shaping up as a year that we have to be very wary of. And at PCS, we will certainly be keeping an eye on it and issuing the CAT bulletins as required. That's what I have to kind of set you up for your panel, which is coming up next. I would like at this time to hand things over to Commissioner Jim Ridling of Alabama, who's going to lead us through a panel discussion of 2017, the year in cats. Enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you. For those of you I have not met, I'm the Jim Ridling, Commissioner in the state of Alabama. Good afternoon. As Alabama's Commissioner, I know firsthand catastrophes. You may remember 2010 when we lost 254 Alabamians one night in the state of Alabama in a number of tornadoes. As I left Alabama, we just had 5. One struck one of our state universities, did major damage to the university, and only God let it be the weekend the kids were gone. Not one student was injured, and dormitories and apartment buildings were virtually destroyed, but they were on spring break and not one student was injured. Alabama's had, like most coastal states, we've struggled with the cost of insurance along our coast and the availability of insurance along our coast. I could not sit up here and not give a lot of credit to Charles Angel, our Deputy Commissioner and Chief Actuary, for the number of things that he's done to promote resiliency on our Alabama coast and awareness, and works tirelessly, Charles has, to make things happen. One of the things Alabama's done is create Safe Home or Strengthen Alabama Homes, which is a grant program to help folks mitigate their homes to at least the IBHS bronze standard. In that program, people not only get up, I think to the bronze standard, it's a 35% credit on your wind insurance, and at the coast, wind is about 70% of the premium on a homeowner. But it also allows that person to get up and go to work the next day, presumably. And that has a huge economic impact when you're looking at manufacturers like EADS and Austal and those folks that are on the Alabama coast. If you look at their disaster plans, every one of them has a section on getting employees back to work as quickly as possible so that their operations don't shut down. Through this program, Alabama has become the leading state in the nation in terms of mitigated homes or homes that have been fortified to at least the IBHS standard. As a matter of fact, Alabama has more homes at that level than all the states combined. So, we understand catastrophes, and the kind of numbers that Steve just showed are beyond my ability to even comprehend. And his last point, which I think is a huge one, the costs that are associated with all this that don't show up in those numbers. And that's the first responders, that's the people that are out there doing what they have to do in these, and their numbers really, really don't show up. So with that introduction, I'm going to get out of the way and let our panel introduce themselves for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll get to some questions that I think came from the audience, and we'll open the discussion to the audience. The reason we're here is to learn from each other. So to the extent we can do that, let's do it. Amy?
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. And I'm going to echo, I think we can't recognize Charlie Angel enough as a person who can now, he's retiring from the department, but his legacy is going to have been as a problem solver and a leader in tackling, I think, Alabama is a real good example of what we're here today to talk about, which is, in addition to lessons learned from recent catastrophes, how is the insurance market, how are insurance markets responding? How can insurers participate in maintaining markets in the face of these kind of breathtaking damage numbers? And I think Commissioner Ridling and his team have navigated their state through some rocky waters, as have the leaders in the states of Florida and Louisiana and Mississippi and Texas, where, again, I used to say, oh, my gosh, when we started talking here about the climate change disclosure survey, and I always said, well, I don't know if we really want to get insurers paying all that much attention, but of course they are, and of course they need to, and but these numbers can be, I think, quite discouraging and daunting to an underwriter and to anyone who's in the business of looking to profit from undertaking risk. So that said, there are lots of innovative solutions that are in play, and I'm very, very pleased to be here on the panel with the purveyor of one who will be going next after me. So I am Amy Bach. I am one of the consumer reps here. Most of y'all in the audience have heard me talk. You might have heard me already talk twice today in related forums about lessons that my organization has been learning from the catastrophes that we've been involved with. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We have expertise in insurance, buying, claims, and the legal side. We were founded in 1991, so we've got 26 years under our belt. We're supported by donors, grants, and volunteers. We are a trusted source for the media. We run 3 programs: the Roadmap to Preparedness, the Roadmap to Recovery, and then our Advocacy and Action program. I'm active here at the NAIC, coordinating with state insurance regulators on a regular basis. This is a picture of the cover of a book we publish called Wise Up, The Savvy Consumer's Guide to Buying Insurance. And what our organization has done over our 26 years is take the lessons that we see people learn, or that people learn after disasters, about how their insurance is performing and what they wish they had done or known before the disaster, and then turning those into guidance for before. So we have, I think, a pretty unique platform as a consumer group. We are not, I know a lot of state regulators put out important preparedness information. We are a little more free, I think, to lay things out. We don't, for people in sort of we try to be diplomatic, but we are not, we don't have to balance the regulator's role in having a healthy competitive market with the interests of consumers. My organization is solely here to give consumers guidance and to be a voice. So some of the advice that we have in there about, for example, not taking everything your agent says as gospel and getting some second opinions. You might not feel comfortable saying that as a regulator to consumers, but we have to say that because time and time again after these disasters, when people have these big gaps, it turns out that their agent did not give them good guidance, whether it was you don't need flood insurance, or whether it was your house is adequately insured, or whether it was not recommending that they buy code upgrade coverage. And again, I have a lot of respect for the producer community, and there's nothing perfect out there. But again, our focus is on giving people the straight scoop. We have what we call a Roadmap to Recovery survey that we've got open right now. We will typically, when we go into a disaster area, at the 6-month mark, we will do a survey, and then we usually do another one at the 12-month mark to take people's temperatures and find out where they are on their insurance claims, whether they believe they have enough coverage to rebuild, whether they what kind of problems they may be having and what kind of successes they may be having. We're here to cover today consumers' experiences in the market in this era of catastrophes, the economic impact of higher deductibles and broader exclusions, the imperative to include mitigation impacts in predictive models, and then facilitating and rewarding risk reduction, which we see very much as a shared responsibility between the consumer and their insurer. What do we know? We know that coverage gaps impede recovery for property owners, strain local governments and FEMA, and create blight. We know that underinsurance, higher deductibles, and excluded and capped perils are the major cause of coverage gaps. We know that some coverage enhancements are a relative bargain, such as code upgrade coverage, extended replacement cost riders. But when we go, say, to the legislature to try to mandate that those things be included, we get a lot of resistance from the insurance sector. So it's a work in progress. We know that mitigation is worth investing in. We know from FEMA, their stats recently are that for every dollar invested in mitigation, you get $6 of reward in return. Now, some people think that means for every dollar you spend on mitigation, you get $6 a discount on your premium. That's not at all what I'm saying or what FEMA's saying. We also know that home insurance competition, availability, and affordability decreases in disaster-struck regions. And, of course, some of that is understandable. Some of that I think is preventable. What's our experience with mitigation? My organization has participated in seismic retrofitting support programs and mandates in the Bay Area, our wildfire mitigation and insurance project, and then the coordination that we have done with coastal property owners, insurers, and regulators on those programs that Commissioner Ridling mentioned. A few quick more things before I pass the mic. The challenges to applying lessons learned after catastrophes. There are substantial disconnects between producers and consumers at the point of sale about coverage and pricing. Consumers often think, well, if this agent's recommending that I buy more coverage, it's just because he or she wants to collect a higher commission. And so my organization has really tried to step up to disabuse people of that notion that in a lot of situations, if the agent is recommending you get more coverage, you really should get it. The resistance to factoring mitigation loss prevention into models and rate reductions by both modeling agencies and insurers. We spent a year and a half in California working to try to get insurers to the table with some voluntary wildfire mitigation support and reward programs. We got zero, so we ended up having to go to the legislature. There's a lack of agreement on mitigation techniques and standards with regard to certain things, earthquake and wildfire. I think we've got great agreement on hurricane and flood, and that's why we've made so much advancement in mitigation and cooperation. Hurricane, flood, wildfire, hurricane mitigation standards, support programs, and ensure engagement is most advanced, and I think the IBHS standards are a factor. Flood is the second most advanced, thanks largely to FEMA and the NFIP. As I said, wildfire is way behind. I'm going to zoom through here. Flood messaging, just because you're not legally required to buy it doesn't mean you shouldn't. Get a quote. The imperatives we all share. Get more homes insured for flood. Preserve everything about the NFIP that's working. Fix what's not. Maintain and increase affordable flood insurance options. Enforce standards, building codes, partnerships, and build viable mitigation support programs, public and private. We must increase private insurers' role in facilitating and rewarding mitigation. I'm going to skip through hurricanes lessons learned. We're going to and then mention just in wildfire mitigation progress. On the plus side, we know defensible space, brush management, fire-resistant building materials, and screening vents all work. On the minus, there's a perception that the proximity of a home that's not been mitigated defeats the efforts of the homeowner who's mitigated. The realities of these wildland-urban interface zones, the lack of standards, and insurers' resistance to mitigation mandates. So to wrap up, consumer challenges related to mitigation. Clearly, we're going to talk some more about what the consumer's obligations are, but we need more information, support, financing, cost of retrofitting and improving mitigation. I think we've got some ways to go in terms of getting contractors in line with doing just what needs to be done, no more, no less. And then we have to help consumers get over this perception that their investment in mitigation doesn't get sufficiently rewarded, that it's not worth it. This is just an example that shows that the kind of savings you can get on a flood premium by doing mitigation. It's very, very dramatic, very impressive, and that's the direction we got to be going. We obviously can't control Mother Nature, but what we can do is help people reduce risk and then try to maintain some stability in our insurance markets and prevent the kind of panicking that we see in some of these areas. I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Amy. Andrew, would you give us a perspective, if you can, from the insurers' side?
Sure.
And thank you.
I'm Andrea Ferrari. I represent Rivington Homeowners. We're MGA that has the pen with Spinnaker Insurance and some other carriers within states to write certain types of business. In California specifically, we're one of the few carriers that will write on an admitted basis wildfire home that are in high-risk wildfire areas, and we have very specific reasons for why we do that. I've been in the insurance industry 25 years, from various programs to claims, product, and most recently with Rivington as a VP of underwriting. The insurance industry itself, so I'm here to kind of give a perspective of what might change given the cats. The first thing to mention is flood. So Amy brings up a good point with flood, that it's a very small take-up rate with flood policies. And part of the reason for that is people don't understand that they actually need it. NFIP offers a minimum base policy of $250,000 in coverage, which may not be adequate for you to reinsure your home, and they feel that it's not necessary. The nice thing is in June, the House made sweeping changes to the NFIP program, which allowed for the private sector to come into it. So what you will see is a great deal of competition coming into the marketplace. And anytime you have that, you're going to have more availability, more affordability, and more types of coverages available to that program. It'll be similar to that of what you've seen with earthquake in California with the California Earthquake Authority when that was introduced in 1994 after the Northridge earthquake. You saw many other carriers start to enter that market, and now we have multiple marketplaces that offer earthquake. Affordability is a questionable remark on earthquake. It is an expensive policy. The smaller the policy pool, typically the higher the policy premiums are. Wildfire is the area and where I can talk the most about in California specifically. I think what you're seeing is reinsurance has to be mentioned whenever you talk about what a carrier's interest would be in any given marketplace after a catastrophe. And the reinsurance market has to be available for those carriers to be able to write that business. Having spoken with our reinsurers recently in terms of wildfire, there isn't necessarily going to be an unavailability of capacity, meaning that you can get reinsurance for it. The cost of that may go up, which the carrier does have to bear. With that being said, there's still capacity available. What makes them nervous is legislation. So when we look at things like legislation that combine coverages or add coverages without premium, it makes our reinsurance markets nervous. So we have to look at ways to sort of mitigate that, and how do we go about doing that? In California specifically, and with every CAT, there's always a model. So the biggest one is AIR worldwide. That's used by the reinsurers, it's used by the insurers themselves, and it's what helps to determine. The good thing about AIR is they will be releasing a new change this year. So there will be changes to their program that will help them be able to better manage wildfire specifically. But that mitigation effort in terms of those models has a long way to go. I think in California, what you'll need to wait to see is how many carriers will look to see and stay in that marketplace. There's a geographic spread in California that is nicely done. It's a large state. But wildfire itself is a small amount of the homes in California, and that will always be the issue. When you look at states like Florida or other states that have a larger geographic spread availability, insurance carriers can look to do that. So I think this year, having talked to our reinsurance, hurricane, flood, all of those are going to be readily available in the capacity It'll be the cost associated with that and what will that look like for each carrier. I wouldn't necessarily say rates are going to be the immediate response from the carriers. They will have to look at them, but any filings that you see go in immediately will probably be filings that were planned prior. The thing that's really important to note with carriers is that when it comes to CATs, we don't look at the claims experience over a short period of time because typically they are anomalies. So we look at them over a much longer period of time. And rates are not a response to manage the losses that have already occurred. They are a response to manage losses that will occur future forward. So they have to look at their overall availability. California, there's a long way to go, as Amy mentioned. Between the insurance market, the regulators, and the state itself, there's a lot more work that needs to be done with that. Ourselves, we actually had homes that were exposed and evacuated. We never had any losses in any of the 3 fires that occurred in California. We had fires that burned within 5 feet of our residences, and that part of what we do is our program that allows us to write the business in California that's a little bit different. All of our homes survived with no losses in that. So it'll be an interesting year to see what happens. Everything is still in play. You'll see flood will grow exponentially. I think wildfire is going to be the area where we'll see legislation and some other barriers that will come up.
Thank you very much. You know, I've often said that if it can happen, it will happen in California. And we have Deputy Commissioner Allen with us today. Ken,
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Ken Allen. I am a Deputy Commissioner of the Rate Regulation Branch. And unfortunately, in California, we do have a lot of experience with these disasters. So I will get to the recent disasters, but I mean, a hard lesson learned, I do want to go back to 1991 and the Oakland Hills fire. And for those of you that remember or recall this, or if you don't, there were multiple agencies and jurisdictions that responded to that fire. However, unfortunately, there was a lack of uniform fire hydrant coupling on the sizes, and the fire trucks that were there couldn't couple up to the hydrants. They couldn't put out the fire, and on top of that, there wasn't a standard uniform communication system. So even had they been able to, the different jurisdictions been able to communicate with the different, ones coming in, tell them where to go, where the fire is, they might not have been able to hook up to the fire hydrant. So that was a hard lesson learned back in 91. And since then, there have been ordinances put in place for a uniform fire hydrant coupling sizes and also for our standard emergency management system. So, each time it happens, we do learn. Recently with the Santa Rosa fires, I don't know if we're at the point for fully understanding everything because the Coffee Park area of Santa Rosa, that was an urban area. That was not supposed to burn, and yet with the wind and how much it was blowing, it burned. So, whatever happens there with lessons learned, that was probably to be determined. And then same thing with Montecito with the flood or the mud flow after the rains, which was right on the heels of the fire. There are probably going to be some lessons learned there, too, that we'll get to at some point. So I do want to cover some of the highlights or areas based on the recent fires that we did go through. And the first one was with out-of-state adjusters that came into California. Through no fault of their own or not sufficient training before coming in. There was some inadvertent misinformation given to consumers. A couple of those were that they were only, the information given was that they only had 6 months to collect their full replacement cost to build, when actually in California there is a law that says in an emergency or as a result of an emergency there are 24 months to get the full replacement cost to build. Some of the adjusters were also advising the consumers that they had to rebuild in the same spot, but yet California law dictates that that's not the case. They can rebuild in another location. So out-of-state adjusters and the information being provided was one issue. Another one was the waiving of inventory lists. Some insurers were waiving the requirement for a full or complete inventory, but others were not, or limiting the amount of contents payments that might go out at 25% or even less. But the commissioner did issue a notice, again, as he also issued notice for the out-of-state adjuster issue, but he issued a notice here as well, requesting that insurers waive that requirement for a full, complete inventory list. And most insurers did follow suit and waive that requirement and did provide 50%, maybe up to 75, 80, even 100% content. So that was a good outcome on that one. Another issue that we ran into recently was some insurers were providing a limit or sublimit on smoke and ash damage. And again, if you look at this standard fire form in California, Any revisions or additions to that an insurer may use can only be used if it's substantially equivalent to or more favorable for the insured. So a limit or sublimit on smoke damage didn't meet either one of those criteria, so that wasn't allowed. So again, we had to do specific reach outs to those insurers that had that limit, tell them not to apply that, and for the most part, the insurers also went along with that. So the response from the insurers was very good in these instances. Another one that we ran into was some insurers had a moratorium on writing auto insurance in an affected area during the fires. And again, these California regulations and statutes get in the way. With good drivers, there is a requirement that companies offer a good driver policy, and there is no carve-out or no exception for an emergency. So again, we had to contact insurers and tell them to not put the moratoriums in place for writing auto insurance. And then the last one that we ran into was the efficient proximate cause doctrine, and that relates to the Montecito mud flow. Because there is strong evidence that the Thomas fire that occurred right before the rain and the mud flows was the efficient proximate cause. Legal doctrine in California says that, while the homeowner's insurance, it may not cover flood, if there's efficient proximate cause in the wildfire being that, in this case, there would be coverage. So there was another notice sent out to all insurers making sure that they look at this, and if it's determined that the fire was the efficient proximate cause, that be covered. There are some additional, over the years, not just related to the last fires over the last few months, but over the years there have been a number of other consumer protection measures that have been put in place from lessons learned, and just to make sure I don't miss anything important. A couple of them relate to a covered cause of loss resulting from a state of emergency, and that first one being that the insured shall have at least 24 months from the date of the first payment in order to collect full replacement costs of the loss. And the second one is that coverage for additional living expenses is set at 24 months. Normally we had seen 12 months for additional living expense, but that change made it 24 in the state of an emergency. Four additional measures that were put into place in the event of a total loss of an insured structure, not just related to fire or wildfire, but in any event, an insured is permitted to rebuild at another location, as I had mentioned just before. And if the reconstruction of the property is not complete by the end of the next policy renewal, the policy limits and the premium must be adjusted to reflect the new exposure. If you don't have your house or you just have partial, there's not as much exposure, so that the premium needs to come down. And the insurer cannot simply cancel because of damage to the property, so no cancellations just because of that. And then the other one is the insurer must offer to renew the policy at least once when they come up for renewal. So there are additional measures from recent experiences learned for the consumers. Another one that we have is that regulations that require replacement cost estimates actually reflect the complete cost of rebuilding a policyholder's home after a fire. There are a number of items that we've put in place after lessons learned. And currently, there are a number of bills at the legislature dealing with the recent fires and some experiences previously, and I'll very quickly just touch on those. That insurers have the option to combine unused major coverage amounts. So if you've run out of your primary structure limit and you have some other structure content limit still available, that could be shifted over to help completely rebuild. There's extended time to rebuild and collect full replacement costs from 24 to 36 months. I had mentioned previously it had gone to 24. Now we're looking at pushing that to 36. There's a requirement for a replacement cost estimate at each renewal. And there is also an Independent Insurance Adjuster Reform Act that is on the books, as well as debris removal. And I do want to cover a little bit on the debris removal. That is an important issue out in California, as well as other states. And basically, back in 2007, the department worked with a number of state agencies to create a consolidated debris removal program. And under the program, once the debris is removed by the appropriate agency, which usually in this case is the county, that agency is responsible for collecting any available insurance proceeds. They send out an invoice, and then the insured or insurer is responsible only for the limit that the policy has specific to debris removal. It's not the insured or insurer is not responsible for more than that. However, over the past 10 years, we have noticed that many insurers have balked at the invoices because of the cost. on the invoice, even though they're not responsible for the full cost. And just to give you an idea, for the Valley and Butte fires in 2015, the average debris removal cost was about $115,000. And then some insurers also like to handle the claims process all on their own. They don't want any outside interference. So they would recommend that their insureds do not participate in the program. So because of those issues, one of the current bills is that the department would require that a consolidated debris removal program is in statute, and it requires the insurers to participate in the program if there is a declared disaster and if the appropriate government agency cites health and safety of the community and or natural resources as a basis for conducting the consolidated debris removal program. And so for the interest in time, I could probably go on with many other things, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ken. I told you everything happened in California. I'm very pleased that David Altmaier can join us today. David, as you know, is the commissioner from Florida, and when it comes to the C Committee and those things to understand about catastrophes and disasters, David's one of the best. David?
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Ridling. I'm flattered by your comments. Thanks for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I am David Altmaier. I'm the insurance commissioner for the state of Florida. A state, as you might know, is prone to hurricanes from time to time. So catastrophes are always, always, always on our minds at the OIR. Two really key tenets that we keep in mind as we look towards hurricane season. The first one is preparation, and the second one is communication. And we think both of those things are critically important to an insurance department being ready to respond after a hurricane. So when people ask me when we start preparing for hurricane season, the answer is we're always preparing for hurricane season. During hurricane season, before hurricane season, and after hurricane season, we are constantly preparing. First and foremost, we are using our financial solvency tools that are at our disposal to assess the condition of the property insurance market of our state. An interesting thing about the state of Florida, if you looked at our top 10 to 15 property insurance carriers, if you're not from Florida, you probably wouldn't recognize most of them. And if you're from Florida, you probably wouldn't recognize any of them either. We had for a while an availability situation where many large national-based carriers pulled out of our state because of the catastrophe risk. And what cropped up in their place were a lot of Florida-grown domestic property insurance companies. And this was in a time period when the minimum required surplus to start a property insurance carrier was $4 million. And you can compare that to some of the numbers that were shared earlier today, and you can probably scratch your head a little bit. Now, fast forward, that requirement is $15 million, which sounds like a lot more, but when you're dealing with billions of dollars of losses, it's still a small number. So we have developed a series of tools in addition to our normal solvency tools to help us accomplish the task of assessing when insurance companies whether or not they're ready for the claims that they're going to experience. The first tool that we've developed, we call it our annual reinsurance data call. This is something that we are developing right now. When I get back to the office tomorrow and Wednesday, we're probably going to look at putting what we call part 1 of the ARDC into the field. And what this does is this asks all of our property insurance carriers what their plans are for this coming catastrophe season from a reinsurance standpoint. Obviously, as you all know, with respect to paying for catastrophe claims, insurance companies don't typically plan to do that all on their own. They have very extensive and robust reinsurance programs. Recently, these have become much more complex with the introduction of alternative capital, such as ILS products, cat bonds, and the things of that nature. And so we spend a lot of time looking at what companies plan to purchase in terms of reinsurance so that we can make an assessment about, number one, whether or not that's an appropriate level of reinsurance, number two, whether or not they have an appropriate mix of products, and number three, how much they're paying for that reinsurance. So we do this in two phases. The first phase is what are you planning to buy, which we normally issue to our industry in the March to April timeframe, which is about 2 months before June 1st, which is the official start of the Atlantic hurricane season. It's also when most of Florida domestic property insurance companies renew their reinsurance program. Then we conduct part 2 about 15 days after the beginning of hurricane season, and that's when we ask, given what you planned to buy, what did you actually go into the marketplace and purchase? So a lot of this relies heavily on catastrophe models. We've already heard mentioned just a moment ago about catastrophe models. They play a significant role for us in the Florida Department because when our companies are planning for their catastrophe risk, they have to model their projected catastrophe risk based on those models, which is a little bit scary because if you talk to modeling experts, the one thing that they will all agree on is that all the models are wrong. So that's a little bit of a scary prospect when you go into a catastrophe season knowing that your entire property insurance market is using something that is really a very sophisticated and very scientific estimation about a pretty significant loss. We're fortunate in Florida to have an independent party called the Florida Commission on Hurricane Loss Projection Methodology, which I think I got all those words in the right spots. But it is a body of scientists, engineers, computer scientists, and mathematicians that review these models for rate-making purposes. So if you're a Florida insurance carrier and you are offering private insurance products to our consumers on an admitted basis, your rates have to be based on one of the models that has been approved by this commission. So if you have your own model that you've created or things of that nature, it's not allowable for rate-making purposes. And that's to address the so-called black box issue. There were a lot of people in our state who said, listen, we understand that you have to estimate catastrophe losses, but a significant amount of the dollars that we're paying for insurance are based on what those models say, and we'd like to have some oversight over what they say so that we can make sure that there's not an uplift that's inappropriate or something of that nature. And so that's how we look at and assess the solvency of our carriers ahead of hurricane season in addition to our normal solvency tools. Another reporting requirement that we have that I think is unique to Florida is something that we call Quasar. At this point, that's an acronym, and I will admit I forgot what it stands for. Rich Kuhn might remember. I know he spent a lot of time with it. Quasar is a supplemental report that is a statutory requirement. It's in the same section of our statute that requires companies to make quarterly and annual financial statement filings with us. And what they have to submit to us is their total number of policies that they've issued by property line of business. So in other words, whether or not it's a mobile home, whether or not it's a HO3, whether or not it's a dwelling policy, condo, etc. They have to tell us the total insured value for those policies, the total insured value for policies that have wind coverage versus those policies that don't have wind coverage. And importantly, they tell us what counties those policies are in. So I have a couple of slides. This is the first one. And what we can use with this data is create tools like this, which show us a graphical representation of our state. Those are the county delineations, and we can see where the policies issued by our admitted market are in our state. So we can, this is our entire admitted market on this particular slide, but we can create graphs of this nature for each individual company. And we can compare a company's geographic exposure in our state to the industry-wide geographic exposure in our state. And we can identify companies who might have a little less diversification geographically than we might otherwise be comfortable with, and start developing a corrective action plan for that company well ahead, hopefully, of when it might actually become an issue. And so this is a very important tool for us. It's one that we can use in instant real time. It's also one that we can track over time, and we can watch a company's reporting, we can watch a company's diversification and where they're growing and shrinking in our state over a period of time, and initiate conversations with that company about what their marketing strategies might be, what their underwriting strategies might be that lead to certain concentrations in our state. The other reporting tool that we use that is closely associated with this is we issue a catastrophe claims reporting data call after each catastrophe occurs, and we can use that information in a very similar fashion. We get the number of claims that are reported by carriers literally the day after an event makes landfall. In fact, with Irma was still exiting the state of Florida, and we were already getting our first reports of where claims were occurring. And again, we get this by county. It allows us to make graphs of this nature. And we use this for a couple of different reasons. First and foremost, when we are deciding where to set up, when we are assisting the Department of Financial Services and helping them determine where in our state might be the most appropriate location for what we call an insurance village, where everybody can bus in their catastrophe buses and set up shop for consumers to come filing claims. This information becomes valuable because we can look to see where there's a concentration of claims and deploy to that location so that we are right in the thick of things with our consumers. Secondly, most counties have an emergency management division of some sort, so having this information on a county level, 10 minutes goes by fast. So having this information on a county level basis helps us communicate with those county-based emergency management teams so that we can help them understand where the insurance is. And then the last slide that I have is taking those first two and kind of merging them together and seeing what the ratio of claims in a particular county is to the policies that are enforced in those counties. And you can see, based on the shading here, that the highest concentration of claims very clearly tracks the track that Irma took as it went through our state. So these are the ways that we try to prepare throughout the year. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing process for us. What I've learned about catastrophes after Irma hit and after Matthew the year before is that all of the policymakers in our state are very, very busy doing a lot of very important things, such as making sure the fire hoses fit to the fire hydrants. The last thing they want to hear about is the insurance commissioner saying, I've got an insurance company that I'm not sure can pay their claims. So we try to do as much work ahead of time to avoid having those types of conversations when there's so many more important things for our policymakers to be doing. And that's generally how we approach preparation to catastrophes in Florida. Thanks very much for being here, Commissioner, or allowing me to be here, Commissioner Ridling. I'm glad you're here too, and looking forward to the questions in a little bit.
Thank you very much, David. I had the opportunity to run two insurance companies. One of them very large and one of them medium-sized, and we never knew what we were doing in Florida. So thank you. That helped clarify it. I'm going to ask Commissioner Doak to finish our discussion today from the panel. But before I do that, I want to thank John for a number of things, but John particularly for the Tornado Summit and the things that have come out of that summit that really fit in the mitigation side of what we do. And for instance, a Cat 5 tornado is a 1, 2, or 3, and then a 3, 2, and a 1 as it goes up and down. And the 3 down is mitigable from a dwelling standpoint. So, John, thank you for that. Welcome to the panel. And
thank you, Commissioner Ridley. It's good to be here, and thanks for my colleagues for letting me sit up here and listen. You guys have all bring great ideas and innovation, and we can learn so much from Florida. We do on a continuous basis, David, so thank you. Those were great remarks. So in Oklahoma, some of the things, we're going to take a little bit different perspective. We've all tried to take different slices of this, but in Oklahoma, we're uniquely positioned in the middle of the United States, so we get just about everything except for hurricane. And one of my colleagues at the National Weather Service that I work closely with, he would actually tell me that we had hurricane effects in Oklahoma at some point. But you can look. We went wind, hail, snow, ice storm, earthquakes. We've been in the national news on earthquakes for the last couple of years. And some of the things that we do on a post-disaster response is maybe unique, and we've been able to learn from our other colleagues around the country, but we are very, very active. We have a field rep service that it deploys out through the state at particular times of the year. They're ready. Our fraud department is very, very active. I see the coalition is here, back here, and we're very, very active. We understand that consumers are taken advantage of at the time of a disaster. So we've really tried to kind of pave the way and learn from some of the things that the NAIC has showed us, but we've also kind of charted some new paths on meeting with folks. So just looking through some of these pictures, one of the roles of an insurance commissioner, my colleagues know this, and you all know this, whether you're from on the regulatory side or from the industry here, but you have to be very responsive to your governor. I know David knows that. I know that in Oklahoma. Some of the things, this is a picture of one of our anti-fraud units. This is actually funded by our fraud unit through the fines that come through for Oklahoma. So we have a couple of wrapped vehicles, but when they run 24/7 after a disaster, you would think that people in small towns and around the state of Oklahoma might think that there's 10 or 12 of them, but we rotate our fraud officers in these. We keep them active, and you would be shocked and surprised when that vehicle rolls down a street after a disaster, how many unscrupulous contractors get in their trucks and cars and leave. It's actually kind of fun if you want to ride with one sometime. But we also do deploy yard signs and things in these areas. We work very closely with, this is the FEMA Command Center that we were with, and I want to recognize David, is it Mustad? I think he's over here. David from FEMA that was here earlier. Thank you for being here. But we work very, very closely with them on a regular basis. We go to our emergency command center at the state. We have a bunker down below our state capitol where everyone assembles during these. All the state agencies come together to work. And you can tell that this is looking at some damage of a strip center coming through one of the latest tornadoes in Tulsa. This happened to be after the Moore tornado, but we have, and this is another picture of one of our billboards that we do, and we've actually partnered with the NICB, but we try to get these up in very targeted areas, because one of the things that we've seen, if you can get to consumers through the media, social media. Again, if you're not at OID 411, go there right now. Just kidding. But social media, we know works. So we hit the billboards in the local areas, and I know that we've learned lesson front page ads in the local newspapers in rural and in city areas to help them understand who they can contact. Has reduced a lot of plans. We utilize the NAIC information on disaster planning. Again, coming through, we've got a couple of different PSAs. I don't know if we're at that point yet that we're going to talk about. And we have getting back to the mobile. We deploy. We've helped our friends in Texas with disasters. I was just recently down in Puerto Rico with our colleagues there, kind of helping them understand different tools and things of how to reach folks that may be a little bit different. Again, we've had the National Tornado Summit going on 5 years, and we've had over 5,000 folks come through that summit. Many of you all have been there, which we appreciate. We continue to learn on that, and one of the things that we're going to do is broaden that we're not going to compete with the Hurricane Conference, but we're going to widen it in the upcoming years to reach all types of disasters, which I think will make that more important. Community events, we have the opportunity to go in and hold. I remember going into a high school. I don't know if there's a picture here, but as a regulator, after one of the largest earthquakes in Oklahoma history, no one else wanted to show up, so I had to show up at a high school gymnasium, and there was about 500 people there. And I had to caution one very innovative young agent that you don't want to sell earthquake insurance at the door for that type of event when people are unhappy. But you come through here, the consumers and PSAs, we've got a program called EAGLE, and that's Ending Arguments Gently, Legally, and Easily. And it's a mediation program that we learned after one of our major disasters. We've shared that with some other states. It's a way that consumers can kind of come in and get their claims moving at a quicker pace, and that's been very helpful. So we've got a lot of tools at the state of Oklahoma, and one of the couple of things that we've learned, we put together what's called an insurance village. Much what David was talking about is that after some of the disasters, we know where the pinpoints are, but we have the insurance industry all stage at one place. And why do we do that? It was in Moore. I can give you an example. It was at Moore First Baptist Church, and we had 30 or 40 CAT buses there. We had to work with the Oklahoma Banking Commission. One of the lessons learned from the Moore tornado was at a major catastrophe, when you have Oklahomans, the average income is about $30,000 to $40,000 per year, and you have consumers getting large amounts of checks on these advances that we talked about. One of the problems is they can't cash that $5,000 or $10,000 check. The bank is going to put a hold on it if they've not cycled through that kind of money, if that's outside the norm. So we had to quickly work with our state banking association and figure out a different way. So they were able to advance some cash, expedite some things with local community banks, was very helpful. But we also discovered that there's some new innovative way. Many large insurers they would give out debit cards, and it helped solve a lot of issues for consumers. Is because instead of giving them cash or this check, they would be able to use the debit card. It would then keep track of everything that they spent that money on, because as we talked before from California, that's part of the claim process. You have to turn that in. And we had folks that they didn't really understand what they could do with those funds. So again, that made it easier for them. They could go to the Walmart. They could go, work with their health insurer. They could, get advanced. They could get things easier than making that additional stop at the bank. So again, we've learned some really basic things from the catastrophe side. I had the opportunity not too long ago, to go to the White House through the NAIC to talk about resilience and mitigation is something that I'm very passionate about. and I think we're going to get into that. But I agree with Commissioner Donlin on the fortified homes, and we've tried to follow, Commissioner Riddling, we've tried to follow their lead and implement a few things in Oklahoma that we'll get to. But again, we're very, very proud of the NAIC and you colleagues that are here, because when you walk through one of these neighborhoods after one of these disasters, and I was let in through the military in the Moore tornado, no one's there. I had the light on my Tahoe, and I came across an elderly couple sitting on the front porch of their home. And I locked in on that, and I walked up there. They could very easily be sitting in this room right now with us. Very educated folks. They were crying on their front porch. And I asked them, what is wrong? Well, they've lost their home. They didn't want to call their kids. They just did not know what to do. And they've never been through this experience before. And one of the things they said, well, how are we going to, where are we going to live? And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, we can't live in our house. And they had their insurance policy right there. And we went out on the hood of my Tahoe and looked through it, and they didn't understand about additional living expenses. So when you think about these disasters and catastrophes around the United States, you would think consumers and people understand some of these things, but they really don't, because they don't ever read their policies. We know this from our consumer advocates. But so you really can't assume anything. But when I explained that to them, you can't imagine the relief that they had. It was like, let's go find you a hotel room. But when you see this begin to work, where the policy becomes reality, is why I'm really passionate about this area of catastrophes, because if we can do a better job communicating, working with these folks, the industry works very well together when it all comes together. So, Commissioner Ridley, thank you so much for letting me make some comments.
Thank you, John. We're going to go to some questions that were suggested, but after hearing what I've heard today, I want to ask, how do we improve the take-up rate in flood? And this is even a more in-depth thought, is how do you protect people from themselves?
Well, actually, we had a good suggestion at the C Committee right before this panel that the NAIC add to its flood reform priorities that I guess Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac that they adopt that mandatory purchase of flood insurance regardless of whether you live in a flood zone or not, but for anyone who's taking out a federally backed mortgage. Thoughts?
Thoughts? I think that was a Jim Donlin suggestion. But just hearing what I've heard today, are there any thoughts from up here or the audience on how we do that? Ken?
Well, the Transparency and Readability Working Group is currently working on a number of infographics and information, and it's all about education and information. So you don't know what you don't know type of thing, and the more information you can get about maybe the cost, and yes, homeowners doesn't cover it, you need a separate policy, and the number of claims that have occurred in areas where you wouldn't think there's a flood, yet flood does occur. So, I mean, that's one area that's currently being worked on in that group.
Any other thoughts? I come from the school that says the agent is the key to all of this sort of thing, and the more we can communicate, educate, train agents in our jurisdictions, the more this sort of thing falls behind us.
Right. That's all right. I was just going to add on to that comment, Commissioner Ridling, and that's why I think the work that the Consumer Readability and Transparency Group is so important, is because the agent is key, but typically when a consumer is buying a home, the agent is probably one of the last people they talk to in that process. And by the time they get in front of their agent, typically the message has already been, you're not in a flood zone, so you don't have to have flood insurance. And the person saying that is well-intentioned. They're saying it because in order for me to give you a loan to buy this house, you don't have to have flood insurance. And I think that really, and I've talked to realtors about this, and they're very sympathetic to this position. I think that message really has to change, too. It's not that you're not in a flood zone. You're in a low-risk flood zone. You're not required to have it for your mortgage, but you should certainly talk to your insurance agent about your risk management practice and whether or not it's right for you. And I think that you combine that with what I don't think there's enough appreciation on the consumer side for the devastation of these floods and these losses. And one of the saddest things about Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Irma, and I know that Texas is likely experiencing this as well as Puerto Rico, is the number of people that were flooded by those three significant storms that didn't have flood insurance and weren't in flood zones. And I think I saw a number that like 20% or something absurd like that of flood claims associated with Harvey had flood insurance.
I think that people in the preparedness community generally have recognized the importance of putting out uniform messages because there's sort of message fatigue, people hearing things over and over. But I think when it comes to flood, if we all, if there's outreach to the realtor sector, to the lending sector, certainly the people in the consumer movement, at least myself, my organization, Bernie Birnbaum, his organization, we're true believers. We've been going out there for years saying just because you're not legally required to buy it doesn't mean you should not buy it. But I think if we all are saying the same thing, that those 2 points, that many, many floods, and I'm sure there's a more articulate way to say that, hit people who were not in a flood zone. So that's number one. And number two, that if you're not in a flood zone, it's going to be cheap, or regardless, get a quote. Consider it, get a quote. And if we are all on the same kind of general page, that would help.
Commissioner Ridley, one of the things that, in Oklahoma that we found is that through our earthquake issues, we did something that was pretty innovative, and I agree with it. Starts with the agent. We had our governor did a special approval, and it's continued today that we implemented, because we had over 1,000 earthquakes in 1 year that were really troubling the state. But we implemented as 1 hour of C had to be solely on earthquake, and we've been talking about it in Oklahoma to make another 1 hour component of flood, just specifically because we saw the take-up rate go up so much through education of the agents. But we also implemented a PSA campaign, and I'm going to show you a quick one on wildfire that we partnered with the Oklahoma Broadcasters Association, which most states have, and they allow you to work with them as a nonprofit, state agency. And so we have, since I've been elected, we've had averaging of PSAs running over 250,000 times a year that we pay. The ad value of that has been about $5 million a year through that process, and we run a series of PSAs. Kelly, would you play that one?
Recent wildfires destroyed more than 600 homes in our state, and most were uninsured.
I'm Oklahoma Insurance Commissioner John Doak, urging you not to eliminate your homeowner's policy just because your home is paid off. In the event of a tornado or wildfire, it covers the cost of rebuilding and repairing your home and contents.
I paid my home off, and I am very pleased that I kept my insurance. That was one thing my husband always instilled, is never let the insurance lapse,
Most Oklahomans' single largest asset is their home. You can't afford being uninsured.
So we have a series of those that kind of hit different topics, and we have most of them run on the radio. But again, educating consumers and targeting these new areas, I think, is something that we have to continue to do through the NAIC and through our respective state avenues and agencies of how we can get those messages out.
John called me a few years ago and said, "How many earthquakes do you have in Alabama?" And I said, "None, 0. We don't have any earthquakes." And he said, "I bet you do." So we put a couple of seismographs in North Alabama, and we were having them all the time. We just didn't know it because it was so small. So, that exposure's there. Similar to the flood, you just got to raise the awareness. Any thoughts from the audience on how we raise the take-up rate on flood insurance? Yes, sir.
In New York, post-Sandy, I am currently involved in a program run through the Small Business Service Center of New York City, and they're using some FEMA post-storm mitigation dollars, and they put together a program where they're partnering with all sorts of community organizations and getting the word out, registering small businesses, and those small businesses are put through an assessment program, and that reviews their building envelope, their risk management, and the biggest portion of it is their insurance, specifically their flood insurance exposure. And with that assessment comes some monetary. They can actually purchase everything from smoke alarms to fire extinguishers and some other things. But they also get a lot of information on flood insurance on the program, why they should have it, where they are. They get a map of exactly where they are and how they're rated. And it's been very successful in getting people to go to their agents and brokers and say, "Hey, I'm ready." I know maybe cost was an issue or other things were an issue, but it really is a good program. It's geared towards small business, but I think a homeowner version of that could happen. Again, how it's funded might be tricky, but just one idea that's happening post-Sandy in New York.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the audience? This seems to be a theme that's all the way through C Committee today and in here, so I think it's on everyone's mind, so I thought we'd try to get to that. To take a step forward, there's a consumer responsibility when it comes to preparedness for all kinds of disasters. In Alabama, for instance, it's not consumer-driven, but we have a hurricane preparedness meeting every year right now. I think it's next week. And the governor, by the way, sits in charge of that. And we literally bring a 3 up Mobile Bay, and by hour and what has to be done, and some of the things only the governor can do. And part of that is how do you communicate with the public on their preparedness and evacuation and that sort of thing. So I'd like to get some ideas on how we speak to the public in terms of being prepared for disasters, everything from, I guess, supplying food to my wife goes around and films the house because we can't remember what's in it, but that's the kind of thing you have to do.
So just to start off and to kind of echo a comment I made just a moment ago, I do think to an extent there's certainly a large responsibility on the consumer, but I think there's an even larger responsibility on the agent community. And where I think the consumer's responsibility is understanding that they have assets that are subject to significant loss if they're hit with a catastrophe. And I think that's what we need to try to get consumers to realize. I was an agent for a couple of years before I joined the Office of Insurance Regulation, and one thing that I remember is that I had a customer come in, and he said, "I have these new rims on my car, and I got to figure out how to cover them because I just dropped mad cash on these rims, and if something happens to them, I want to make sure that I'm reimbursed." So that's an example of a consumer that recognized, I've got this thing that's important to me, and I don't want to lose it. If something happens to it, I want to get indemnified for that. But I don't know how to do that. So I'm going to go talk to my agent and let them take it from there. And so I think getting consumers to understand that they have these risks and going in and seeing their agents and being open-minded and having that conversation and changing the conversation from I'm here because I'm getting a loan and they said I had to be here to I'm here because I'm troubled about what I might lose if I'm subject to some kind of loss. I think if we can achieve that and then let the agent community take it from there and have a robust insurance marketplace that can serve those needs, and I think we're going to make some significant strides forward in protecting consumers.
Well, I can tell you that when you ask most people on the street who their insurance is with, they tell you it's the agent, not the company. So that in itself tells you how important the agent is in this transaction.
So, well, first of all, after a disaster is a great opportunity to get messaging out about preparedness. That's when people are paying attention. Up in Sonoma, the local newspaper has been running extensive coverage about the underinsurance problem since probably December. So again, you have sort of a window of opportunity, which I'm sure Commissioner Doak and Commissioner Altmaier have taken advantage of in their outreach efforts. There's that. There's also the power of visual education. So I always praise Angie whenever I see her with the Missouri Department because the Missouri Department did a wonderful, funny little video clip showing the message was about making sure your insurance coverage is adjusted to your current asset values. And they had this funny picture of a guy wearing pajamas that were too small for him. And, you wouldn't wear pajamas that are too small. And it really stuck with me. So that kind of visual kind of messaging is critically important because, words whoosh, right over the head, right? But an image, that helps people understand that it's their asset at risk. Because a lot of people, just like they may not know who their insurance company is, they also they think, a lot of people will think insurance is insurance. It just is, it doesn't have nuances to it. And so getting people to sort of get that it's their stuff that's on the line. It's not a matter of the insurance company's profits or whatever, it's your stuff.
Any other thoughts?
Just relative to a couple of things, the NAIC home inventory is something that we really try to push in Oklahoma, and messaging is that, after a disaster, it's too late. If you don't, that picture is really worth a lot of money there. And one of the things that we've also, that dovetails nicely into this is we followed Alabama's lead with the fortified homes. And we have House Bill 1720 was passed last year in the Oklahoma legislature. I think it becomes effective April 1st. But that it allows insurance companies to give discounts and rate reductions for fortified homes based upon actuarial standards. And what we found is when I begin to look at this, and Steve mentioned it earlier, when I've got a picture in my conference room in Oklahoma City of the Moore tornado and the one that happened the previous 2 years before, and when you overlay this on top of each other, some of these folks that stayed in Moore, Oklahoma have had their homes replaced 3 times. And you say, what is it? Is it this area? But they now have the strongest building codes in the state of Oklahoma. And don't get me started on building codes because they're not enforced. We need to do better about that all across the United States relative to mitigation. But if you haven't been, couple of years ago, Ray Farmer hosted us at IBHS offices there for the first indoor hailstorm. And I begin to look at the IBHS, which is funded by the insurance industry, some of their workload, and we've studied Alabama. But this video clip I think that you're going to see is about 30 seconds. But if you haven't seen this or visited IBHS, but we have these new standards in Oklahoma where Oklahomans can now get discounts if they build to a higher standard, which I think is something that we're all interested in because that will ultimately impact claims ratios and rates. Kelly, will you play that? And I don't think it has sound. Is that correct? A little bit. So obviously, one is fortified and one is not, right? And if you begin to understand this, and the industry, they're the ones, many of our large insurers across the United States and internationally actually fund this research, and we're very, very appreciative that they did that, and we had the opportunity to go. But we pushed very hard at our Oklahoma legislature to get this implemented where we could create some form of change. The Habitat for Humanity in Tulsa was one of the first. They're going to start building habitat houses around the country. Commissioner Riddling, 2 fortified standards to give examples. So it's just another avenue.
They actually, John, help us in the inspection process down on the coast, and that's great. One of the questions here is, what have you done to promote mitigation in your state? And you've heard a lot about that, I think, from the panel. But one of the things that we have also done in Alabama that I think helps is that we have got the multi-listing services listing homes that have been mitigated, so that when people are looking to move into an area, they can see the homes that have been mitigated to the IBHS, at least to the bronze, and that seems to be a pretty strong selling point for the multi-listing agencies.
Just to kind of dovetail on the messaging part and, the talk of the agents and their responsibility, the younger generation is so tied to this. They're buying their insurance just with this. So, responsible use of social media to get out messages about that as well, I think it's going to be big moving forward. The agent can do so much, but if the younger generation is not going to agents, they're using this this is a tool also to get the message out.
Thank you, Ken. We just hired a person in our PIO operation that's what their job is, to help us communicate better with that generation, and as that generation changes. John?
I think something that's never talked about in catastrophes that kind of dovetails in with this messaging conversation is, if you've ever been through one of these, like David or I or Ritalin and some of the others, is there's a health insurance aspect of this. Is when you have a large-scale community that they cannot get their prescription drugs, they've got kids at home, they're elderly adults that have issues. That should be the first priority through any catastrophe. And we've worked with our Oklahoma health insurance companies and programs there to make sure that they are up to speed, not just our property and casualty folks are up to speed, but you've got to have a way to expedite, get new drugs in, because if they just renewed some drugs and they're all gone and they're dependent upon that's life critical stuff, especially dealing with disabled citizens. So again, just as a point, I always try to bring that up. And we now have health insurers in Oklahoma that have catastrophe vehicles and things to be able to get out into the communities, which is something I'm very proud about. It's not really talked about. You don't see it, but they do need those services.
Any other thoughts on that issue? If not, I will recall the tornado outbreak in Alabama in 2010, which is the worst disaster that's ever hit the state. And about a week, 2-3 weeks after that, the largest homeowner insurer in the state called and said, "Commissioner, we'd like to come in and talk to you about what we're thinking in terms of our homeowner rate filing that we're going to be bringing to you over the next month, and we'd like to come up and talk about the issues in that filing and kind of prepare your folks for the way we're going to present it." So they came, and they sat down in my conference room, and I looked at the guy that ran government relations for the U.S., and I said, "What do you got in mind?" He said, 3%. I said, "Where do I sign?" The state had just been wiped out. And they think that far ahead, the really good, the really big, the folks that are in this business. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how do you keep companies engaged after catastrophes.
That's an interesting question, because if you think about it, insurers and reinsurance assume 100% of the risk. So when they're taking on states such as Florida or California, they have to think about that overall perspective and that geographic spread. I think it's unrealistic to think that some of the large carriers will not start to pull back, because geographically they don't necessarily have to be in the entire state. I think California is going to be a prime example of how that will occur. I think Florida's done an excellent job of working cooperatively, and that's probably the biggest piece of this. It's politically unpalatable for insurance companies to come in and say, we have to take rate, but it may be necessary based on an actuarially sound decision, and then it becomes, what is the health of the market and how does that look? From my perspective, working in this industry as long as I have and working in product and having worked with regulators, I think it needs to be a cooperative between the regulators, between the state, between the municipalities. All of those things have to be variables. In California specifically, the state needs to work better between how do we manage this housing crisis, because the most available land in California is in the wildland-urban interface. They predict that that interface will grow. It will double over the next 5 years. So now you've got 16 million homes as opposed to just 8. So how do we control that? How do we ensure that? And how do we make sure that it's affordable for everybody coming into it? We get conversations from our end. We do it a little differently. We inspect 100% of our homes. We work with the insureds themselves to educate them not only on how they mitigate their home this term, but continue to maintain that over the years, and how often, how easy it is. It's a little different with hurricane or tornado, where you can actually fortify your home once, and that's usually adequate. In wildfire, you have to do it year after year after year. It's a maintenance process, so it's educating them. We need the state's help. We need to be able to have, maybe in California, the regulators looking at smaller carriers like ourselves who can come into the state and help with that, as long as there's not an insolvency issue. So I think there needs to be a broader look at that as an overall, as a cooperative, as opposed to sometimes what's perceived as an adversarial relationship.
Probably no one can speak to this better than
Yeah.
David.
Well, certainly, I'm interested in Amy and your thoughts as well. But just to echo that, I think that's exactly right. And I think what our goal is in Florida is to be able to experience catastrophes really without missing a beat. And I don't want to downplay that phrase, without missing a beat, because obviously catastrophes are very impactful to people's lives, and I never want to downplay that. But from an insurance industry standpoint, I've been very encouraged with how Irma has played out with respect to our insurers' reaction. Because when we look back to 2004 and 2005, what we experienced was significant losses and companies coming in and saying essentially, here's the keys. Sorry about that. And they were taken out of our market. And if they weren't doing that, they were telling us we're going to pay all of our claims, and then that's it. We're out of here. And so what we'd like to make sure that we're doing is putting our market, assisting our market in getting to a position where they can experience these losses and say to us, we're paying our claims. We don't envision we're going to have significant rate increases or need significant form changes or need significant geographic redistribution or things of that nature. And a lot of the reason for that is because of some of the tools that we've put in place, such as the graphs that I showed you ahead of time, where we spend so much time talking with our industry about where they're writing, how they're writing, what kind of rates that they're putting in place. And having those conversations before catastrophes even happen, we introduced a reporting tool that I didn't mention, and I should have. We developed a stress test in addition to our annual reinsurance data call, where we take specific historical events and we give them to our insurance industry and we ask them to run them. If Hurricane Andrew hit our state today, exactly the same way it hit in 1992, what would the condition of your company be? And what would you do in terms of capital? What would you do in terms of rates? What would you do in terms of geographic redistribution if that were to happen again? We change the scenarios up every year so that companies don't start writing to our scenarios. And it's been an effective tool in understanding where the risks are and how we can get into a position where those events can happen and our industry can pay their claims and move past those and still be a part of our marketplace.
So I think California is going to be an interesting case study for the next year because, and clearly, you know, I was very impressed by what Commissioner Altmaier's slides about their monitoring tool, because I think that's critical. You know, in California, before this nightmare wildfire season, there was already had been weakening of competition and shrinking options and sort of a non-renewal plague, if you want to call it. There's been debate over what word to use. Not a crisis, I'm asked to say. And of course, you know, that part of this is upper management's going to notice. You know, there's a big wildfire and, you know, some large total losses. It's going to get the attention. And then, you know, the job often will then fall to the regulator to try to maintain calm. And those of us, you know, on the consumer side will say, well, why are they now suddenly non-renewing all these properties after a wildfire when there's not that much left to burn? And so I know, you know, to a certain degree there's perception and there's reality. But again, before this wildfire season we were having problems. Why? Drought, tree mortality, and the new, this, I don't want to name names, but a modeling, risk modeling program that a number of carriers have started using. And I don't know, coincidence not, many of their customers have been non-renewing large swaths of their business. And this was happening before the bad wildfire season. So clearly we don't have the kind of monitoring tool that Florida has implemented, and I think that is important to kind of, you know, nothing like facts to keep things moving in a good direction. But we do have in California a law that requires an insurer to give a homeowner at least one renewal guaranteed if they've lost their home in a disaster. And again, there's now legislation being considered to expand that and to raise the conditions under which an insurer can non-renew in an area where there's been a disaster. So I think, you know, again, I think industry would be wise to come up with some ideas of their own, or at least to provide the data to the regulators voluntarily so regulators feel like they have a handle on the market, on non-renewals, and on the growth of the surplus lines market share. We're not there yet. So I think until then, there's going to be action in the legislature, because clearly this isn't just about, insurance is not just any other product. Once people have a hard time getting insurance, that interferes with real estate transactions, and we all know the drill from your coast and from your coast. So I think, we've learned a lot in Florida, and hopefully we'll be taking those lessons. But again, I'm interested to know what the California department's thinking.
Yeah, you mentioned tree mortality, and California does have a tree mortality task force itself that the department is part of, and you've part of, and many other entities are part of. And that's part of the problem. It is a problem right now that's going on that's trying to get discussed, but in terms of reaching any resolution, we're still fighting through that. And, I've had conversations with a few people with regard to the issue of companies who are non-renewing or canceling, and even then, like you said, it was happening before, but it was also intimated. Even then, it isn't really viewed as an availability crisis. It's more of an affordability crisis. So while some companies, and they're not pulling back from the state, they're pulling back from certain areas, specific wildfire areas. They're limiting their writings there, or they're retaining some, but they're canceling others. So they're limiting there. But despite that, there are still other options. There's still availability. It hasn't been pushed as that issue. It's more of the affordability. So that's the problem some homeowners are facing, is that even if they are getting renewed, it's the cost that has gone up. So that's another issue that we're trying to address.
It's also that the market is shifting away from the captive, the brand name companies that somebody will have been with for 30 years old, been with State Farm, they get non-renewed, they don't even know there is an option. So to a certain degree, we've been able to solve some of these problems through educating consumers about independent agents.
In California, and I grew up in the industry out there for a lot of years. People love to have shrubbery and plants near their home. And it was always a struggle. You'd clear cut, go out, inspect, and then 2 or 3 years later, and I understand that. So I think the key to that is to try to maintain some of that clear space, and from a practical standpoint. And also, it's the same thing we experience on the coast. More and more people tend to want to live in those areas, similar to the wind and the wildfires.
Yeah, and part of that, we get back to the mitigation, so we've kind of come full circle around there, where there are a lot of things that can be done, and the department has a great site on its website where it has specific to catastrophes, mitigation efforts that can be done not only for wildfire, but for earthquake and flood, because those are two other ones that, hit the state as well. So, that part is there, but it's still, the consumer does need to be educated about mitigation and the benefits. And some insurers have come to us and said, if there's something that can be installed in California, similar to like a wildfires program, or other similar to the, on the East Coast with the hurricane, a similar type of setup where there might be 3 tiers of available coverage, depending on the mitigation and what tier you're in, we've had contact from some companies saying that if that gets in place, we would be willing to come in.
Thank you. I'm here because Cheney didn't come. And I want to tell you that when I first became commissioner in Alabama, and we were trying to find companies that would write wind insurance on our coast, and that was a huge issue. A lot of companies were going without wind. A lot of the companies that they formed in Florida to write wind wanted to diversify and get into other states. So I had the opportunity to catch them going through Alabama before they got to Cheney. So we benefited from a lot of those companies, and I very quickly tried to keep them from going to Cheney first and back to Alabama, so we kept them in Alabama. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Well, good night, honey.
Those are your pajamas from the 5th grade. They're too small.
That's funny. They fit when I bought them.
Wearing old clothes that don't fit anymore is not a good idea. Neither is an old homeowner's insurance policy that no longer fits your house. Do you have enough coverage to rebuild if your house is destroyed? Meet with your insurance agent to find out.
I can sleep better now.
With the right insurance coverage, you will too.
Is that from Missouri?
What we realized going through the Joplin tornado is that we had experienced more situations where we couldn't help consumers because they were very, very underinsured. So we worked with the City of Joplin and the Missouri Insurance Education Foundation to do a little consumer education on the 1-year anniversary. And so we got some free television advertising, used our departmental video resources, some creative minds back at the department, came up with that commercial and kind of rolled with it. So thank God everything still lives forever on the internet. Well, actually not. Don't look for any flood videos.
Well, unless someone else has something they want to bring to throw on the table, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for spending the time with us this afternoon. It's been a learning experience for me. Thank you, folks.